Good afternoon, everyone. I am your host, Connor O'Brien, and I am the Sustainability Policy Coordinator with the American Apparel and Footwear Association. To start things off, a quick overview of AAFA. We are the National Trade Association representing apparel, footwear, and other sewn products companies and their suppliers, which compete in the global market. Representing more than 1,000 world-famous name brands, AAFA is a trusted public policy and political voice of the apparel and footwear industry, its management and shareholders, its more than 3.2 million US workers, and its contribution of more than $490 billion in annual US retail sales. AAFA drives progress across three key priorities, namely brand protection, supply chain and sourcing, and trade logistics and manufacturing. So if you encounter any technical issues during today's webinar, please do contact Zoom support. For your convenience, we are recording today's webinar, and we will make both the recording and the presentation slides available in AAFA's Learning Center within 1 to 3 business days. We do value your insight and questions. Please feel free to share them throughout today's presentation using the Q&A box in your Zoom toolbar. We will address all questions during our dedicated Q&A segment at the end of the presentation. So I am thrilled to introduce our expert speakers today. Please welcome Dr. Kate Jones, the Senior Science Advisor joining us from Oritain. Over the last 10 years at Oritain, Kate has driven the development of the Oritain product and science delivery of cotton, wool, mohair, and cashmere verification programs. Today, Kate is bringing exceptional insight into isotopic origin verification, which is a proven and reliable method for evaluating origin claims independently of traditional supply chain mapping tools. Today, she'll be sharing valuable perspectives on what isotopic testing is and how it works, how the technology is used in supply chain traceability and due diligence, and what steps you can take to strengthen your due diligence programs. To help facilitate this discussion, we have Anna Hinojosa, the former CBP executive and Oritain advisor now. Anna has had an illustrious career with over 34 years of experience in law enforcement, international trade, international policy development, and standard setting, both with US federal government and with the World Customs Organization in Brussels. Now I am pleased to hand things over to Kate and Anna to begin their discussion.
Thank you, Connor. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. As Connor mentioned, my name is Anna Hinojosa, and I am pleased to be able to kind of moderate this panel with Kate. I want to remind everyone that on January 16th, we had another webinar with AAFA, hosted with AAFA. The title of that webinar was 2025 Compliance Trends for Fashion Brands and Retailers. And during that webinar, we did go over a number of the challenges that brands and retailers are facing, and some of which are very newly fresh in everybody's mind with regards to tariffs and where country of origin really makes a big difference. And so today, I think one of the things that that is important about what Kate will cover today is really talking about the science and really getting into how the science works. I think that we spent a lot of time in the last webinar, and I'll early plug for Connor that the webinar is on the learning site. And so you can go back and rewatch that. I think that what will be important is to really understand. In November, CBP did put out some guidelines with regards to isotopic testing. And as part of those guidelines, it really was about re-emphasizing the importance of transparency and traceability into the supply chains. And I think all of the most recent announcements with regards to tariffs and where those tariffs will apply, as well as other regulatory requirements, whether it's for forced labor, for carbon measurement, for due diligence, all of those really have an important need for being able to verify the origin of the materials that are in the goods that you're importing. And so today we get a chance to learn, how does science work? And so why don't we kick it off, Kate? And so can you tell us how isotopic origin verification actually works? Can you break down the science for us a little bit?
Yeah, I will. And actually for this, I'm going to pull up an animation because I think it helps having a bit of a visualization. I'm a bit of a visual learner myself. So just bear with me a moment. I'm going to attempt to share my screen with the PowerPoint deck that I have here. And are you able to see the PowerPoint?
I am.
All right, so we'll kick in. So what is product verification and what does that actually involve? And so at Oritain, we essentially combine forensic chemistry and data science to create what we call origin fingerprints for natural products. And we can do this because nature actually imbibes its signature into natural products in terms of where it's from in the chemistry. So it can do that through things like soil, through atmospheric processes, through climate, and we're able to tap then into the chemistry of the product to see where it's from. So to do this, we get samples from their primary source. So for cotton, that's from fields. We analyze then these samples for their natural chemical properties. And in that, we mean we analyze things like trace elements and stable isotope ratios, and these relate back to the origin. And so then we can use our proprietary statistical models to unlock these chemical features. We then transform these into a reference baseline, which we call an origin fingerprint. And this relates back to then the origin of where that product has been grown and where it's from. And then once we do all that, once we collect the samples of the origin that we're after, once we analyze the chemistry and then evaluate these with our statistical models, we're then able to put these origin fingerprints back into our origin database, and we can then use these for future testing. And what we actually mean then by future testing is we can use these as a baseline to test samples throughout the supply chain in order to see whether or not they're consistent to claim or if there's other things that are happening. And so we're going to take you through this now in the next slide. So we can do this then essentially in two different approaches. We do claimed origin testing, which is essentially authentication testing. So let's say we have cotton sample with a claimed origin of India. We use then that to match the test sample against India, and we get a match. Compliance testing is where we do not want sourcing from these origins. We then can test a test sample against the reference baselines that we hold for these origins. If there is a match in this respect, that means that there is a high degree of risk, there's risk origin detected, and then that means then we can provide that information for our clients in order to then mitigate that risk. And so that's the science in a nutshell. I'll exit out of here before I talk a little bit more. So we're back onto our screens now. So yeah, it's a forensic approach. It is not adding anything to the product. So we're not adding any kind of foreign tracers. We're not using anything other than what nature imbibes in the product itself. It is different than DNA. We often get confused with DNA testing because people think, CSI, it must be DNA. I'll say that DNA is what is a product. So we can say, is that then ELS cotton or is this a varietal of apple? That is not our type of testing. Our testing is related to origin. So it's where something is from. And so as I've mentioned, we use trace elements and stable isotopes to analyze then those chemical features that are imbibed in from nature, use our statistical properties. And what we're essentially doing is we're creating then a reference baseline. So that's where the origin fingerprint, the CSI aspect comes in, because once we then have that reference baseline, we can then test samples against it. And so similar to, when you get, a human fingerprint, like a suspect that's read against a suspect database for origin fingerprints, we can do the same thing, except we're doing it by origin and we're doing it by product-based testing.
Great. Yeah, I think that will help some of the folks out there better understand, what that is. I think, I know for me, a number of people that I have networked and interacted with, they often ask, okay, we may have different tiers of manufacturing. Where does it make the most sense to do testing with regards to isotopic testing? Can you address that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a fantastic question because we know that the supply chains are opaque and often people only have access to those tier ones. And the beauty of our process is we can test throughout the supply chain. So we can test at the ginner, we can test at the spinner, we can test all the way at the retail shelf. So we can test flexibly at these different points in the supply chain. However, we know that once fabric is produced or once there's product that is on shelf, that's kind of where it's too late. The adulteration or the risk has already occurred. And so while it's great that we can test at that point, you're basically either left with having to destroy the goods, or you're, with a very expensive problem. So we want to be able to address, where the risk is actually happening. And at least in cotton supply chains, that is earlier on, at different nodes. So we know that it's happening at the laydown. So that are different bales of cotton, there can be mixing of different bales, either to adulterate an origin or to put in, there is risk cotton that's introduced there. Or we know that yarn can be, spun and introduced. So you have to be testing at the yarn stage too, once that's going into fabric making. And so what we can do with our type of testing is test at these different points. We do say that earlier you test, the more actionable information you have to actually make a difference, and before you have a problem then at a product stage. And so that's where really we emphasize the testing is early, and to be able to do actionable things at that point.
Thanks, Kate. I want to just make the point. It might sound like I'm restating what you said, but I think that from the perspective of importers, it really makes a difference on where they have control over their supply chain. So if they have control only at the finished product, then that's where they should do the testing. But if they do have greater controls or want to get greater controls, they certainly can adjust their contracts to allow for testing earlier in the process, which could then give them better coverage, better opportunity to remediate any risk. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. And that's it too, is, we are not a policing system. We are there to provide clients, information. And if that's starting then at tier one, that's where we can start to unpick. And we know that, again, that you have trusted suppliers that you may be working with for many years, and they're doing all the right processes. They are beholden onto their own suppliers. And so being able to do this type of testing means that there is transparency and accountability in it. So it helps to then, move that system earlier on to actually discover where is the source of the issue happening. And so, yeah, what we've seen, at least with this type of testing, is it's really provided educational moments where, suppliers have realized that they have issues and they are able to, remediate those for their brands. And so, yeah, it's less of a policing, more of an insights driven. And I think that's where it allows then for accountability, but also participation in the supply chain from the entirety of the system, which is really cool, at least from my sense.
Yeah, I think one other thing that you just mentioned is worth kind of reinforcing. When a commercial client engages Oritain and they do the testing, can you restate who gets the results of the testing?
Absolutely. So when we do a testing for the client, it is the client that is receiving the test. It is not going anywhere external to any enforcement bodies. It's not going to the supplier. It is going to the client for their own knowledge and insights. And we can work with the client in terms of our experience, in terms of how to address nonconformities, because we know that, people have relationships with their suppliers. It's not just about eliminating specific ones or, 3 strikes you're out. We want to be able to provide actionable insights that can be used to educate or to remediate. And so the clients obviously do that themselves, but we can provide that expertise. And yeah, so it does not go to anybody else in terms of regulatory.
Yeah, I think that's an important clarification, because some people may be concerned about, well, who's going to get access to the information with regards to our tests. I think some companies err on the side of, if I don't know that I have a problem, maybe I'm safer that way. But in fact, that's not really true. I think more and more, certainly in the US, but also in other regulatory regions, there's a great deal of emphasis on due diligence and not taking advantage of technology that's available to help you really police your supply chain is not demonstrating due diligence. And I really think that the guidance that CBP put out reinforces that this technology is available, and that importers should take advantage of this technology to exercise due diligence or reasonable care in their supply chains. Now, often we hear about different solution providers, different isotopic testing solution providers, some of which may also be in the audience for today's webinar. I think it's important. Can you tell us, are all isotopic testing solutions the same, or is there a difference with regards to accuracy and confidence level on the testing?
That's a great question. And there absolutely is a difference. And that's why with the CDP guidance, it's about doing, due diligence before you take on an isotopic provider. It's not even, isotopic testing, it's framed in scientific process. So, in terms of the actual process, that will be the same or similar, but the key things that you're getting the differences is what are your outcomes look like and what is your reference baseline. At Oritain, we are very proud of our reference baselines. We have tens of thousands of samples that we've captured from cotton growing areas all over the world. And we've actually just calculated that we have 96% of cotton by weight accounted in terms of growing, accounted in our reference baseline. That is the gold standard, because you cannot determine, in terms of confidence, you cannot determine a reference baseline based off of a handful of 30 samples or 50 samples. That does not encompass the variability of the growing population or the potential input of what is there in terms of growing. I guess secondly, in terms of that, it's about having a robust number of samples, but it's also about where those samples have come from. At Oritain, our ethos is to provide forensic level testing. And for that, we have to have primary samples. So when I say primary samples, that means that samples that are collected as early on in the supply chain as possible. For cotton, that means at the point of harvest. So they are picked off the plant during harvest. They have GPS coordinates with a high degree of chain of custody, because basically to have a reference baseline, you have to have the highest truth of accuracy. You cannot be having samples that have been captured, at yarn or at fabric represent your reference baseline, because there's risk of adulteration. So there's no way that that would hold up in terms of authenticity or assurance in the court of law. And that's where Oritain, we basically, our ethos and our provision is based on the forensic standards. And that also comes back to what is our outcome that we actually provide. So what our outcome that we actually provide is based on a consistent or inconsistent result. It is very much a yes, is this authentic? No, it is not. Yes, is this compliant? No, it is not. That means that these answers are underpinned with the highest degree of certainty in terms of statistical testing. And that means that we're not providing, you have 60% or 40%, potential that it's coming from X origin, or that it's, 50% compliant, because, what does that actually mean? Does that mean a coin toss that determines whether or not you're compliant or that you're authentic to label? And so that's where, in terms of providing isotopic standards, there is a difference in terms of the robustness of database, the outcome that we're providing. And also it does come into, Oritain, we're very proud that we have been pioneers in the isotopic testing. And so we've really driven a lot of that in terms of the actual analytical techniques. And so, I think what we're proud of at Oritain is we have that highest level of robustness and standards, so that you are getting forensic level outcomes.
So again, just to unpack that a little bit more, I've seen some certificates or results from some testing or isotopic testing solution providers that say that the confidence level for the testing is 60%. And often, of course, Oritain is not necessarily the cheapest solution, right? It's not the lowest cost solution, but oftentimes importers or manufacturers will ask, why should we go with Oritain at this higher cost than with these other solution providers who seem to offer the same service, but for a much lower cost. Are you able to talk just a little bit about what a difference it might be to have a test that has a 60% confidence level versus one that has 90% confidence level?
Yeah, and I will, and I guess too, with the statistical robustness, we are looking to achieve over 90%. So oftentimes that's getting above 95%, so we're getting into really high confidence levels in terms of our outcomes. But yeah, I think it kind of goes back into what are you using these results for? If they're used for business decisions, say, can my goods enter the US? In terms of meeting compliance, you absolutely need, the highest level of assurance, but you also need a very firm, yes, it is compliant, or no, it is not. If you're putting on your label that you are using organic United States cotton, you need to have the assurance that you are actually getting full authenticity, because something like that is not going to be authentic and is not going to meet, our upcoming greenwashing laws if it's only 60% USA cotton or 40%. And so this is where, I guess, yeah, in terms of our technique, it is more expensive, but we are providing then that forensic level assurance that it is, and we have had scientists and people within our company as expert witnesses in the court of law, because this is actually admissible in the court of law. And so it goes back in terms of having those statistical standards in terms of what are the outcomes. So that highest level of consistent, inconsistent, basically yes, no, you're not having any ambiguity in those types of results. But also in terms then into the robustness of the database, we've built our database to basically reflect the nature of the cotton in the supply chain now. So having all the biggest growing areas represented, having those major sources of cotton, including areas that fall under compliance risks for forced labor or other issues. So those have to be represented in the database with robustness, with the accurate number of samples, in order to provide that kind of service. And so I guess that's why we are more expensive, is because we provide that level of assurance.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kate. Before I go on to my next question, I want to remind the audience that we are going to open it up to some questions from the audience. So while I'm getting Kate to answer another question, I want all of you in the audience to start thinking about what questions you might have. We do want to make this interactive, and we want you to get the most out of this webinar. And if for some reason there's something that we haven't answered, I'm sure other attendees who are either watching live now or will watch this as a recording will be interested in what your unanswered questions are. So please don't be afraid and start submitting your questions. So the next question I have for you, Kate, is how do you envision, or for companies that are looking to integrate isotopic testing into their broader product traceability and transparency initiatives, what are some of the best practices that you would recommend? Obviously, in the market, there's a lot of solution providers that are offering solutions for pieces of an overall transparency program, and it seems unwieldy, I think, for a lot of compliance teams that are trying to find the best, most effective solution for their company. So what are some of those best practices? I think inquiring minds will want to know.
So that's a fantastic question. And I think the key thing with our product is, we're there basically to help enhance existing information. So, we're not there to I guess, remove existing traceability efforts or any kind of supply chain mapping or blockchain. We're there to help enhance these existing features. And that's really where I can see, our product being best leveraged, is to use this as a way to authenticate information that you do have. And so, a great example of that is we work with Supima on their ACRE program. They do use a blockchain solution, so Textile Genesis, as a way to, just streamline and sophisticate, the aggregation of their information, and also ensure that there's compliance at each step of the supply chain with the Supima label. And what we do with our testing is basically underpin that, because we do know that while, things like blockchain and while, sophisticated supply chain mapping can provide some fantastic transparency and clarity on the supply chain, it is not an authenticator. And so that's what's really cool, is that we can independently authenticate. I think some other guidelines is, being able, we see clients come in and not really having any knowledge about, whether or not their suppliers are compliant or anything, just start where So as we talked about before, if you only have access to tier one, we can start doing that type of testing. And that's where you can start really to engage your suppliers. And so telling them that we are doing this testing, again, we're not a policing system. This is a way for you to engage with your suppliers to get insight. And one of the great ways that we've been used is for that education piece. And so, if there is an issue in terms of, say a claimed origin like USA, you're wanting to support a USA claimed origin, providing your suppliers with that education piece on the need to segregate cotton and the need to have these products labeled. And we can be there to underpin this type of process. We've actually had a client that worked with us for this similar type of thing where basically they used us to evaluate what was the level of compliance before they started this education program and afterwards. And I think they started about 60% were compliant for a claimed origin. After they did the testing and after they engaged with their suppliers and provided them this new education piece, they saw compliance over 90%. So that was a huge success. So it's about not just thinking about, oh, this is something I need just for regulatory. This can be a way to provide transparency on your own supply chain, and it can also help in terms of answering questions in terms of those sustainability things like we talked about before. And so if you have sustainability aspects, say you are trying to use organic cotton from the US or regenerative cotton, we do not test that aspect specifically, but what we do test is to ensure that these types of attributes are coming from those claimed origins. And basically we are an authentication test to ensure that each point in the supply chain, then that product is authentic and therefore your sustainability claims are authentic.
That's fantastic. I am super excited to see that we have a lot of questions already in the queue.
Yeah.
I think one of the questions that I'd like you to answer before we get to those questions is we've been talking quite a bit about cotton. Obviously, it's a big concern because of there being so many risk origins related to cotton in different imported products, and a lot of risk origins in cotton products around the world. And so it definitely is something that we talk quite a bit about, but there are other products that Oritain has done isotopic testing on, and ones that will be market ready this year. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what's exciting too, is that this method is not just for cotton. We can use it anything that has, derived from the natural origins, or even things that, have a manufacturing can create its own fingerprint. And so we're really excited, wool is something, Oritain is based in New Zealand, and New Zealand being a massive wool provider, that's something that we've done for many years, but we're scaling up in that sense. And that includes other animal fibers like cashmere, mohair, alpaca. And so, these are all using the same sort of technique where we're developing a reference baseline and then can evaluate samples to see their authenticity. No compliance origins that I'm aware of for wool or animal fibers. We're also doing leather. So leather is really exciting because obviously there's a big difference between animal hide and the leather bag that you carry from a chemical and processing standpoint. And so that's some of the things that also too we've been able to make breakthroughs on in terms of being able to analyze these samples and still capture that chemical signature from the origin from where they're grown. So leather is very exciting. And then we're thinking about other food goods that might be falling under, things like the European Deforestation Regulatory Act. So that's coffee, potentially some things like timber. And so, those are things where there are sustainability attributes associated with them, and we want to ensure that they're not coming from areas that are deforested. And so this technique can be applied in many different ways. And then we're really just starting to scratch the surface on where we can go with it, which is exciting from the science point of view.
Yeah, one other one that I mean, you did talk about the leather, but I think one of the areas that Oritain has a historic experience with is beef in particular.
That's right. Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, and again, because we're based in New Zealand, and New Zealand as a a very significant red meat, beef and lamb producer, and that's something that we have experience in. We've got a already developed database for beef around the world, and so thinking about things again with grass-fed, that's something that we support in New Zealand and can support from other origins if that associates with that claim. But going into deforestation, that's going to be a huge concern, is ensuring that beef does not come from areas that are deforested. And so that's absolutely something this type of isotopic testing can support.
Great, thank you. I'm going to start with some of the questions that have been submitted. And I'm sorry if I'm coughing, there's allergies everywhere here. One of the questions that came in from Linda is, how do you ensure that what you tested at the ginner is the same cotton that you test at the mill?
That's a great question. And I think, this is where it comes in. We can test at each of these points of the supply chain. And I think it's about then understanding what is the client's need. So we get our reference baseline even earlier than the gin. We are getting these off the plant during harvest. And so we can actually audit at the ginning level to make sure that these are authentic to claim. That's really cool about the technology, is we can get down even in some cases to farm level resolution, so we can authenticate that. And I guess then if there's a question of ensuring that what's at the mill is with at the ginner, what you're actually going back to is saying, is the gin cotton, is that back to the raw cotton baseline, yes or no? Is the yarn sample or the mill sample, is that consistent to the raw baseline, yes or no? And so that's what we're doing in practice, is having that highest authenticity in our reference database, and then evaluating. So we're not necessarily having to do gin to yarn or yarn to fabric, that kind of connectivity. We're all going back to the raw baseline.
Right. I think maybe this example might make the case a little bit more. Maybe we can explain it, unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
Obviously, from the perspective of the fashion industry, and where we're talking about cotton, we're really looking at, well, what are the compliance factors of cotton, and what does either the mill, or what does the garment assembler or the importer, what questions do they need to answer to determine what their risk level is within their supply chain? And so generally, I'm going to say the importer doesn't need to know that the cotton is, in many of the regulatory requirements, doesn't need to know that the cotton is necessarily from a particular gin, but they do need to be able to trace where the cotton came from and ensure that there isn't other cotton that shouldn't be in their product there. And so to that extent, you talked a little bit about, does it match the cotton that we think it is, and you are able to match the footprints or the fingerprints, or we want to make sure that it doesn't contain some of the ones that are prohibited or have other issues with them, and so it's like a negative, nope, that one we know we don't have that. Can you talk just a little bit about that, because I feel like I'm messing up your science answer?
No, and this is great having your perspective, because obviously, yeah, I'm the science, but having the application of how this is in the supply chain. So yeah, it is about, and this is where we work with our clients in terms of, we still get information about what claims and paperwork are there. And if there is concern that, basically that inbound gin lint is authentic, and that, the yarn is authentic, this is where we can then apply that testing. And so we actually do that for our clients. We can test inbound gin lint prior to spinning, and then we can test the outbound product for authenticity. So that's the key thing. And the beauty of this technology is we have the freedom to test at all these different stages, but we really work with our clients in terms of understanding where is the risk to test. And if there is the concern of, I might have a suspect, these bales might be mislabeled, and, that it says it's gin in the US, but I suspect they're not. We test that, we can test that, and then we can make sure that, it's not just great, you have, the right ingredients. we can ensure that the right practice is happening with the correct bales, the right bales being put into the laydown, and then having the outbound yarn or further down the fabric being authentic then. And so, yeah, I think, and hopefully that answers the question, but the key thing is that we are not relying on each part of before in the supply chain for authenticity. We relate everything back independently to our reference baseline, which is raw. And then we can evaluate each of those risk points in order to determine, where the risk is coming from.
In the context of EU deforestation, for example, if it would the requirements for deforestation do put in place a requirement for the exporters or importers to be able to map out, polygon out where they're collecting these raw materials from, to ensure that these raw materials aren't coming from places that are evidence of deforestation, right? And so in many cases, you're having to do GPS or polygoning of the different farms. And how that would work is Oritain would be able to work with those farmers and take raw samples of whatever the product is, whether it's the timber, whether it's the cows, whether it's coffee at the site, and be able to get raw samples, test those samples, and then at some point in the future, if those were exported to another country, they'd be able to match and say, yes, this belongs to that farm, or no, that doesn't belong to that farm, that comes from somewhere else. Am I saying that properly?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And that's it. And that's what we're doing for our EU-DR clients, is being able, they're already going through that due diligence process of the polygons, but, being able to really identify where is your genuine source and area from, ensuring we're capturing that in a reference baseline and an origin fingerprint, and then being able to authenticate it back to that. And then, the implication is, if it's not authentic to that there might be a concern that it's deforested, or, so it's even about, if it is not authentic to your source, it is about, undertaking investigation and mitigating that risk, because if it's not authentic, it's not what you think it is, and there is potentially risk of it coming from deforested areas. So that's precisely, the approach we take.
Okay. Let's see what next question is here. I'm going to read the question. I hope that I'm reading the question properly. This is from Sanjay. It's great to do traceability with DNA. This is isotopic testing, by the way, not DNA. But with this isotopic fingerprint process. However, what's the solid foundation / validity of the data bank? In other words, the reference library. What is the foundation of the reference library?
That's a great question. And I think that's where, our validity is in these primary samples. So primary, again, that means that these are samples with the strongest chain of custody. They have GPS coordinates. They have a robust amount of metadata associated with them, and they're taken at the earliest point in the supply chain. And so that gives us the assurance that these samples are authentic. We know that they've come from these areas. And that means that then that underpins all the other testing that comes. And so I guess in terms of robustness, primary is only what would be upheld in the court of law. If you had, secondary to quaternary, and with that, I mean samples that, are coming from fabric or, other sources like that don't have that strongest chain of custody, it just doesn't hold up. It doesn't meet admissibility. And so that's the foundation then of our science and the foundation of our product offering.
Okay, one of the other questions is from Scott. Do you have any programs for isotopic testing for small importers, or is your testing only for large customers, like a large retailer in the United States?
Mm-hmm. So that's a great question. And I mean, it's not a science question, but I will say that we are able to support, numerous people, whether they be small and large. And also too, we talk a lot about brands. What we do with our type of testing is being able to empower and support anyone that's working within the supply chain, be it producers, be it mills, manufacturers, And so it really is not just for the big, big box retail brands. I think if you are curious, I'm obviously the scientist, but I would reach out to an Oritain representative to figure out what kind of solutions we can deliver, because yeah, we're definitely egalitarian in that sense.
Yeah, and I do have to mention that there have been some conversations with AAFA to see if there's some collaboration that can be done through the AAFA umbrella to support smaller businesses. Obviously, if you're a smaller business and in conducting a risk assessment, I think there's another question that's out in the questions about how does an importer or manufacturer identify the samples to test? And that's, I don't know if you want to talk to that, or I can speak a little bit to that, Kate.
Yeah, you speak a little bit of that and I can help add. Yeah.
Fill out any blanks that I leave. So whenever an importer, a client approaches Oritain about putting the isotopic testing solution into their supply chain risk management and due diligence traceability process, there is an interactive process where the Oritain account managers will undertake a review of the company's operations. In what locations are you sourcing materials from, both finished products as well as intermediary products? Where might the highest risk be? Where are the biggest volumes coming from? A little bit of a more complete picture of what the manufacturing and sourcing scope is for that client. And based on that, there is a risk management approach put into where there should be a random testing, but based on risk. And so there is a whole system of identifying, applying that risk management program against the manufacturing structure or the sourcing structure for that client. And if you're a small company, obviously that would be a little bit easier to do and fewer samples required versus a large company that sources from many countries, many manufacturers, and with many complex manufacturing procedures. So it is very customized to the individual client, and with a strong effort towards ensuring that the client can have a good assessment of what their risk is. It's not 100% certifying that nothing will ever be there, but it is about exercising due diligence in ensuring that you're applying the risk and taking steps based on identified risk, and having a cross section of the entire supply chain being tested. This is not, you have 1 million products, but 5, and you're going to try to justify your due diligence with testing 5 products. That's not really something that Oritain gets involved in, nor would it be sustainable as a credible claim for exercising due diligence. So I'll stop there, and Kate, please fill in the blanks.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And the only thing I would add really is, we are not a testing service. Actually, we are a supply chain solutions provider. So in that sense, when we're talking about when you're talking about being able to identify volumes, identify risk, we actually have models and statistical models and data to support where we should test, at what frequency, at what volume. And so that is there to help then, to underpin these. And so, we are not there to just test, 5 samples a year and say, yep, all clean.
Right. So I'm going to go to another question. I think often there's a question about, okay, what if you don't have just straight cotton in the fabric of the product? Can you speak a little bit about that?
I can, because scientifically that's really exciting. So we know that there's many products out there that aren't just cotton. There are many non-cotton blends. And so what Oritain has done is we've developed proprietary practices to actually remove those, say, synthetics or non-cotton constituents. So then we are only focusing on the cotton itself then for the evaluation of the origin verification testing. So we have developed processes for a whole suite of different blends. So that includes many synthetics like elastane, polyester, nylon, many different synthetics. We can do regenerated cellulose, which is really, from a science perspective, really interesting and cool, because you're basically removing cellulose from cellulose. to only be focusing on the cotton. And we can also do a variety of different cotton and protein fiber blends. So again, we can do cotton and wool and cotton and cashmere. And so again, we have a full list. I would just reach out in order to get that. But the key thing is, because each of these can contaminate the origin fingerprint of cotton, it's making sure that there is a very strong, robust process behind that. And so, yeah, we're excited that we have a proprietary process then that removes all those constituents. So we're only focusing on the cotton.
Okay, another question from Manmohan Rai. Now that Oritain has amassed isotope/chemical data from across the cotton growing regions of the world, have you encountered any specimen that proved to be challenging where the data from two different growing regions seemed to match?
That is a great question, because we do know that there's areas of the world that have similar kind of climates, similar growing areas. And I mean, if you think about it, for different attributes for cotton, you are wanting, there to be similar kind of climates. So that's why, California is kind of similar to Egypt, to similar to Peru. The key thing there is having two things: that very robust population in terms of the robustness of the database. So again, Oritain's is unparalleled. We are able to do investigations statistically that have never been done in the academic or other sense in that. So we've developed tools specifically for supply chain authentication. And so with that robustness of data, we're able to dig in. But also we come from, I come from an environmental modeling background. Many of the scientists do. We have a very firm understanding of what are the environmental drivers behind these origin fingerprints. So we're able to undertake some really cool environmental modeling in order to, there are similarities to be able to differentiate and ensure, again, that we're able to identify or authenticate these origins with forensic level accuracy, so over 90%. And so, yeah, just to succinctly answer your question, we can do that through extreme robust data, through bespoke statistical models, and with that knowledge then of the underlying drivers of the environment.
Great, thank you. Another question, and I'm not sure that I understand it, but I'm hoping you do. Yep. It comes from Barbara, and the question is, can you give an example of a nonconformity that can be adjusted with Oritain's experience/knowledge? I think Connor wanted to answer this question. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe we can clarify that question. Yeah. Oh, you're still on mute. Sorry.
Just so you can continue answering the question, so we can keep the Q&A together.
Okay, so you said keep going? Okay. The next, so are we answering this question, Connor? I'm a little confused.
Oh, we are?
Yes, please.
I guess, can we repeat the question? So have we identified a nonconformity and been able to address it? So I guess what I guess in that standpoint, a nonconformity from the Oritain perspective and what we provide to our clients is that there is something happening that is either not expected or shouldn't be there. And so basically it is a signal to apply action. And so when we do these types of tests, so say it's a nonconformity, it is inconsistent to claim, or it is consistent to risk origin, that is a red flag for the client to dig in and to apply mitigation there. It also might be, be able to understand the problem more. So we can say, well, is this just limited to this one batch of cotton, or is this a supplier issue? If we're wanting to answer that second question, that's where we would apply more testing. And I guess that's, again, for us to be able to uncover insights. Is there a systematic issue that is driving this, or was it something where, the wrong lot of cotton got in? And so this is where, again, we're not just a testing service in terms of you get an answer and the client just, go off and do what you need to. We are there to provide the clients with our expert support in terms of what other actions can be done, what other types of testing can be done. I guess that's what my interpretation of a nonconformity is from our side. Anna, do you have any other things and maybe we can talk to in terms of a nonconformity?
No, I think if there's further clarification on the question, feel free to type it in, Barbara, in another question. And if we haven't properly addressed your your concern. I'll move on to the next question because we have so many more questions and so little time to get to all of them. We will answer the questions. Whatever we don't get around to, we'll send them back through AAFA. So please feel free to send them in to Connor and the AAFA folks, and we'll turn them around after we get a chance to review them. The next question is from Melissa, and I'm going to rephrase the question, but hopefully it'll get to give you enough so that you can answer it. There are multiple prohibited region sourcing that there are compliance issues against. And in some of those places, there's restricted access to the samples. How can Oritain authenticate samples from those prohibited areas if they can't go in and get samples today?
That's a great question. And so I will say that for any origins that we offer that offer compliance, we do have reference baseline samples from these areas and primary samples. So, you know, we have had to ensure that we do have access to these areas at one time or another. With some areas of the world, you know, the access to these has been more recent where you haven't been able to. And I guess in that sense, that goes into how can we ensure that we're providing a product that is useful after every harvest and year on year end. And so that goes into the science. We undertake very diligent maintenance activities. So we are constantly evolving our database throughout the world, getting samples and doing maintenance investigations to ensure that the baselines are stable for those areas that we can't access. So we can't access them anymore, but we do have a robust baseline. We basically use other areas throughout the world as our canary in the coal mine to evaluate, is there any potential that there has been a shift due to, you know, some environmental forcing and things. What I can say is that particularly the stable isotope database, these are very robust, and these are not driven by, you know, weather conditions. They're not driven by annual conditions. So these are more interdecadal kind of conditions. So they are more subtle. We have not seen a shift in our isotopic database for anywhere in our origin baseline. And so with that, and that's even for places like we have really quite high resolution for California for before and after the drought and the flooding. We also have Australia with the long-term drought, and also before and after in Pakistan with the floods. And even with these extreme weather events, we have not seen any shifts with the isotopic baseline. And so we feel very confident that our risk origin databases, even if we cannot access these anymore, are stable and are usable for auditing. And that goes back into, again, what we do. We're not just collecting data, we are experts at the environmental drivers that are creating these origin fingerprints. And so what we do have access to is we have access to satellite data, to environmental data that gives us knowledge about what these environmental forcings might do to the origin fingerprint. And so, yeah, just to summarize, we do that in two ways. We have our robust maintenance sampling for everywhere else in the world, and then we have those understanding the environmental forcings that can impact. And so for those risk origins, no shift. And so where we've accessed them and have primary samples, they're still usable for auditing.
Great. We have a lot more questions that we're going to be able to answer. And so I'm sure Connor will give us some instructions on how to get those questions answered. I do want to try to sneak in one or two more. One of the questions from Dot is, if our factory has some samples needing to be tested for isotope testing, how long does it take to get a report?
Great question. And so, you know, it does take, there's a bit of a process there. Obviously, the samples need to be collected. And so we get those collected there through a provider or a party like Bureau Veritas, which partner with us to be able to go and access these samples, ensure that they are in our sealed sample bag and have a high degree of chain of custody, because similar to our primary databases, we want to ensure that our auditing has that forensic level of, you know, assurance in terms of the data capturing and the process behind. So if they do need to be collected, they then need to be sent to one of our sample reception areas throughout the world. So we are in New Zealand, but we have multiple reception areas throughout the world. So we have a few in Europe and also in New Zealand here. So if depending on the time that takes for shipping, a couple days. And from there, once they are registered and then prepped and analyzed, that is now 15 working days for normal samples. And again, we're evaluating about how to improve that. The limitation really is in the chemical analysis. It is not in terms of actually handling or processing and investigating the samples. We use great automations for all of that. It really is in the chemical analysis. And so we are undertaking investigations in terms of how to shorten that time. So from the time it lands in the sample reception facilities, and then in terms of when you get reporting, that's 15 working days.
But Kate, can I just provide maybe some additional context to
Absolutely.
that in that Oritain, to my knowledge, doesn't do just ad hoc testing. Like you can't just show up at like a drive-through and get your test done. So not just anybody can send a test and Oritain will do it. It really is part of being part of the company's risk management and due diligence program. And so it needs to be a conversation. So if you do have tests that you need to submit or have tested, please reach out. We'll get somebody to talk to you about it and give you all of the details on what steps need to be taken in order to ensure that you're picking the right samples and that you've got a good program in place that's going to be worth your investment. Because having one or two tests done is not really going to be demonstrative of due diligence or reasonable care. It really is only going to give you isolated information. But if you can put it as part of your compliance program, it'll be so much more valuable to you, and certainly be part of the reputation that Oritain wants to maintain with regards to its fidelity in the work that it does. We have a lot of other questions. Let me ask this one. Daniel, can you provide insights? And I see Connor, he's going to look at us that we're running out of time. Can you provide insights into the common reasons why a test result might be inconclusive? Are there specific factors such as fiber finishes or trace fibers from other origins that would typically contribute to this outcome?
That's a great question. And so, in terms of trace fibers, because often we've had people say, oh, maybe they didn't clean the lint traps between runs. And I guess that the key thing is, while this technique is very robust and sensitive, it isn't that sensitive where it's going to be thrown off by I guess, very trace contaminants. And so where you might get it inconclusive, we do, so the isotopic testing is extremely robust to many different types of chemical treatments. But, this is again where we are, always going to err on the side of caution in terms of providing a false report. If there is a treatment that we encounter that we have not, investigated, we will potentially flag that to a client and say, can you help us better understand? Or, it might be inconclusive now, but with some understanding of the type of testing and the treatment to ensure that it fits with the isotopic testing that can later lead to an actual outcome. Yeah, inconclusives, if there is something that is a non-cotton material within that product that is analyzed. So again, we have a massive suite of different blends that we can do. If there's something that isn't on the label, and it's amazing how many times we actually have that where the composition label does not actually meet with what's in the product, that can be a point of inconclusive. So again, these inconclusives are a way for us to work with our client in terms of better understanding what is happening with that test, and is it driven by something like that that's funny, or is it actually driven because there is non-compliance? So with that, I will finish my.
Kate, thank you so much. I see Connor nervously waiting for us to be quiet. There's a number of great questions that we didn't get to. Connor, please tell them how they can get them addressed.
I will, absolutely. So thank you so much, Kate and Anna, for really a marvelous session. We've really had some excellent questions today. I don't think I've ever seen such a robust set of Q&As. And so I do want to thank everyone for their thoughtful participation. So again, for any questions we didn't get to address during today's session, we are going to send them all to our speakers. We're going to follow up with you directly via email to ensure that all your inquiries are answered. So whatever you put in the chat, do not worry, it will be answered. So before we close, I'd like to highlight several exciting upcoming events in AAFA's calendar. For those interested in hearing about how to navigate the impact of tariffs on global trade, I do invite you to join AAFA at the Global Supply Chain and Trade Conference hosted by American Eagle Outfitters in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, taking place from May 6th through 7th. Our newly expanded two-day Traceability and Sustainability Conference will be taking place this year in Atlanta, Georgia. The event has sold out for 4 consecutive years, so I do encourage you to register early so that you can join us from July 9th through 10th. Early bird registration is still available for this event. Lastly, please mark your calendars for our Western Hemisphere Apparel and Footwear Compliance Conference on November 20th in Guatemala City, Guatemala. I encourage you to share this event with your suppliers as it will dive into key areas of compliance, addressing current challenges, and exploring strategies for enhancing operations to meet and exceed compliance standards. Registration for this event will open soon. I want to again extend our sincere appreciation to Kate for sharing her insights with us today, and to Anna for a masterful job moderating the discussion. A special thank you to Oritain for making this session possible, and to each of you for your very active participation and engagement throughout the session. You will receive an email within 1 to 3 business days with a link to the session recording on AAFA's Learning Center. You can also find the recording of Oritain's last webinar that Anna mentioned earlier on AAFA's Learning Center right this second. So we look forward to seeing you at our next event, and have a wonderful rest of your day.